Okay, I'm going to talk through some useful quotations that might come in handy if you get a question on time for Romeo and Juliet. By no means are these the only quotes that you could use and the only arguments you could raise, but it just gives you some useful ideas of what you might want to explore in your answer. So first of all, you might start with actually talking about the irrelevance of time, okay? And that would actually show some critical thinking rather than just simply thinking about the question and how important time is. Maybe time wasn't that important to the Elizabethan audience. At the beginning, in the prologue, Romeo and Juliet are described as star-crossed lovers. Their love is described as death-marked. There's a sense of inevitability with their tragic end. We know that from the beginning. Bearing in mind, remember you've got to link to context, the Elizabethan audience would have believed very much so in fate and destiny. So you could argue, regardless of the passage of time, in some respects, it would be irrelevant to the Elizabethan audience because regardless of how long it took for Romeo and Juliet to get to their death, it was inevitable because that was their predestination as mentioned in the prologue. So you could even start with that or maybe have that as a final paragraph to kind of critically analyse whatever you've previously said. But there are definitely other things you can say about time that helps us understand some of the characters. So, for instance, you could say that the passage of time, or the very short passage of time between Romeo being heartbroken over Rosaline and falling in love with Juliet, encourages the audience to call into question how genuine his love is. So, just as a reminder, he tells Benvolio, "Thou canst not teach me to forget," when referring to Rosaline. In other words, there's no way I'm going to get over her. Yet, just a few hours later, when he finds himself at the Capulet party, he sees Juliet and he asks himself, did my heart love till now? So this is a good one to compare kind of the declarative sentence of how sure he is that he will never get over Rosaline, and a few hours later, the use of the question to actually show his lack of certainty. So Romeo doesn't really know his own mind. So how could he possibly know if this is the real thing? He thought Rosaline was the real thing, and now very quickly his attention is drawn towards Juliet. And the one person in particular who notices this himself is Friar Lawrence, who says, "Young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes." Now, what he's referring to here, obviously, heart being a symbol of love, and the eyes in this case really representing a shallow type or a superficial type of love. Bearing in mind, the Elizabethan audience would typically be a religious audience. They would see priests, that's what the Friar Lawrence is, as a person in their community that they would look towards for guidance and wisdom. So they are likely to really listen to his or respect his observations. But some things to think about. This wasn't necessarily unusual for the time. Remember, Romeo is from a rich family, the Montagues. Marriage at that time was seen much more like a business transaction. Okay, it was really about maintaining their wealth, their status, and that really did encourage a superficial type of love amongst that class. So you might include in your answer that this actually, or his approach to love, his fickle approach to love, might not be that surprising considering the class he is from. Um, Thinking also about the very little time that has gone by between Romeo and Juliet from them meeting and from to them marrying. There's less than a day really in it. And after a few hours of meeting during the balcony scene, Juliet says, "If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow." She's really quite forward here. Um, And that would be very unusual. So, looking down here at context, Elizabethan women were expected to be coy and subservient. They absolutely would not be the ones to instigate marriage. So, she is really going against the normal conventions, if you like, of what a woman should be like, or a girl. Um, but what you could also include here, which I haven't put in this presentation, is the fact that Queen Elizabeth I is in power at this time, and she too was somebody who really challenged conventional ideas of women. She was very powerful. She refused to marry. She was very independent. So, in her own way, she challenged the conventions of women. Is Shakespeare doing that as well with Juliet, and presenting a girl who takes her future in her own hands? And doesn't always listen to her parents and follow their instructions. And again, we come back to Friar Lawrence, who warns Romeo and Juliet, these violent delights have violent ends. So, because of the very little time that has gone past, we know that both Romeo and Juliet are very impulsive, and Friar Lawrence is warning them through the repetition of violence that this is actually very dangerous, and the word violent especially foreshadows their brutal end. Of course, we know that they will commit suicide. One thing to keep in mind, however, is yes, I know when we've talked through this in class, there's always this, what? So they marry within a few hours? That's ridiculous. You also have to bear in mind that this was a play and that Shakespeare needed to keep his audience entertained. So Shakespeare actually reduced the plot of the original poem by Arthur Brooke from 9 months, so actually this all happened over 9 months in that original poem, to just 4 or 6 days on stage. So you might argue that this is actually more to do with the fact that Shakespeare needed a fast-paced play to make sure he can include the whole plot and to keep his audience entertained. So again, that would be something that you could be quite critical about and get those higher marks. You might argue that the passage of time creates violence as well. At the beginning, in the prologue, the feud between the Capulets and Montagues is referred to as an ancient grudge, especially the adjective ancient implies, a disagreement, a feud between the two families that has gone on for a very, very long time. And with that comes this deeply embedded hatred. And obviously with that comes violence. And that could explain away. So time being important because the passage of time has heightened the hatred for both families and therefore encouraged these violent scenes that we see at the beginning of the play and during the climax of the play between Mercutio, Tybalt, and then eventually Tybalt and Romeo. Once Romeo kills Tybalt, he says, "Oh, I am fortune's fool." Again, coming back to this idea of fate. So it's interesting, again, coming back to this argument, well, is time really important? Because actually what Romeo is saying here is that he's not in control of his actions. There's a sense of, again, inevitability, the personification of fate. Look how they've capitalised fortune. Suggests that he's not in control. It's his fate that's in control and has caused Romeo to kill Tybalt, to react to Mercutio's death in this violent way. And he's going to pay the price because he's going to now be in exile. So some things to think about here. Although illegal, duelling was seen as a noble way to settle disputes. And there were many disputes between Montagues and Capulets. But I think, again, coming back to this idea that the audience really did believe in predestination. So again, calling into question, is time really that important? This was always going to be part of the plan. So this violent altercation between Romeo and Tybalt, with Tybalt eventually being killed and Romeo being banished from Verona, that was inevitable. That was going to happen anyway, regardless of the time this feud has lasted. And then finally, towards the end, we have this great pressure on Romeo and Juliet for many reasons. Romeo has been banished, and so he obviously there's pressure of time because after their wedding night, they have very little time before Romeo has to escape before daylight. But we also have pressure on Juliet as her wedding with Paris has been brought forward by her father. Um, so that pressure of time, you might argue, causes them to kill themselves because they can only see their only escape from time is to kill themselves. It's the only power they have left. So when Romeo is leaving Juliet in the morning, it's about to become day. Um, you'd have to double check this. I'm almost certain it's Juliet. I've forgotten now, but I think it's Juliet who says, "In a minute there are many days." So this is quite hyperbolic language, but what she's really trying to reiterate here is just how unbearable life will be without Romeo. That she will feel like every minute is a day. So again, time is important because their time together is precious to them. Um, and what you might say is the pressure of time brings on these suicidal thoughts from both of them. Romeo says, "Come death and welcome," again personifying death as if it's something he has no control over. But especially the imperative verb "come" shows a willingness to die in order to be with Juliet. And later, Juliet says to herself, and this is when she's faced with the predicament of marrying Paris, um, "If all else fail, myself have power to die." So she realises her only escape from this whole predicament is to kill herself. It's the one bit of power that she has. I haven't written it here, but you might want to link this to the fact that she lives in a patriarchal society. So, her options are very, very limited. And so she is kind of exercising the only power that's left, the one over her own life, the one, where she chooses to breathe or not. So she's willing to kill herself. It seems the only option that's left for her. She has no other choice. Her parents have chosen for her, or especially her father has chosen for her to marry Paris. So some things to consider. Actually, the word suicide did not exist in Elizabethan times. It was referred to as self-murder. And self-murder would have been considered a mortal sin by the Elizabethan audience. So this was really a taboo topic for the Elizabethan audience to watch, to explore. One thing that would help is that it was set in a different time and a different setting. So it's not set in Elizabethan England. So that might make them feel a little bit more comfortable, and they would be able potentially to sympathise with Romeo and Juliet a little bit more. But maybe the fact that it is such a terrible sin and Romeo and Juliet are so willing to do it, maybe it would encourage them to appreciate how much they love each other instead. And I believe that's everything. So those are just some things that you could explore for this question. Like I said, there are plenty of other things. There are so many quotes as well about night and day. Something about the inconstant moon, for instance, where during the balcony scene. There are lots of things that you could have explored instead. These are just a few ideas of what you could explore in that answer.